Today's daf is daf Yud Dalid, and here that I gave yesterday, we got up to Vayosar Hamelech Es Habato, which is, if you count down about 9 lines down from the top, the first word in the line is Valavai. And as I mentioned to David last week, these Agaditas, they're wonderful Agaditas, but it's impossible to fit it into one app, just physically impossible. I apologize for, but I didn't write the script. Vayosar Hamelech Es Habato. So Achashverosh takes off his ring. It's the official ring of the kingdom. Omar Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, there's a deeper meaning here. Because you know that Achashverosh handed over that ring to Haman. Is Gedola Soras Tabas Yosem Arboim Ushmon Revim B'Sheven Aviyas Shenisnabu Lehem L'Yisrael. Once the ring was given over to Haman, the people realized that they're in deep, deep trouble because Haman was able to sign with the signet of the king the destruction of the Jewish people. And that had such an impact that even the 48 prophets of Israel and the 7 prophetesses of Israel, and the Gemara is going to tell us that there were more than just 48 prophets and more than just 7 prophetesses, but in any event, none of the Nevi'im, as great as they were, had the impact of bringing the Jewish people to do tshuva. The ilu asaras tabas, it's the rasam lemutav, and it's only as a result of this evil decree that was signed by Haman in the name of the king, because the king had entrusted the ring in his hands. That's when the Jewish people realized that they better do tshuva, otherwise that's it, kaput. None of the Nevi'im subtracted nor added anything to the Torah. And the reason for this is because the Torah says Bal Tosif and Bal Tigra, Chutz mi Mikra Megilla. So Mikra Megillah, which is a mitzvah that's rabbinic in nature, was the exception to the rule. And now the Gemara is going to address the question, well, how could this be? How could they establish the mitzvah of Megillah when there's a mitzvah about Tosif? And the Gemara could have also mentioned Chanukah, but Chanukah comes much later. So Purim is Purim is during the period between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni. Chanukah is 200 years into Bayis Sheni. So that what we're going to learn now is sort of a precedent under what conditions can you actually add a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And once we know the answer to that question, it will justify not only Megillah, but Chanukah as an injunction that came more than 2 centuries later. My Darush, where did they find a basis to create a brand new chiyuv mitzvah d'Rabbanan without violating Bal Tosif? Amar Rav Chia bar Ovin, Amar Rav Yeshua ben Karcha. They derived it from a Kal V'chomer. You know that Kal V'chomer is one of the Gimel Midos HaTorah Nidreshes, but you could derive halachas from a Kal V'chomer. Uma me'avdus l'cheres amrin, and Shira, when the Jews left Mitzrayim, they recited Shira, and that was just the termination of slavery. It doesn't indicate that the entire Jewish nation was in jeopardy of being decimated. But in the case of Haman, Mimisa L'chaim, that we were designated to be completely annihilated, and therefore God gave us life. Is all koshken. How much more so do we have to recite Shira? And the Gemara is assuming now that this will answer our question as to why we read the Megillah, that the reading of the Megillah itself has some sort of a significance and fulfills the requirement that we derive from this Kal V'chomer. But the Gemara asks, wait a minute, Ihachi Halil Nami Nema, we should really be reciting Halil. And the word Nami here is problematic, but let's just interpret the Gemara without the problematic word Nami, but they should be reciting Halil, right? Shira is a song, which is Halil, and therefore our obligation to sing praise to Hashem would be fulfilled not by reading the Megillah, but rather by reciting Halil. We don't recite Halil on Purim. And the Gemara now is going to give 3 answers, 3 explanations as to why we don't recite Halil on Purim. Again, none of these answers are going to really address our question about why the Chachamim and how the Chachamim were allowed to add a mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah. So that we'll have to come to terms with that question. So answer number one, this is a very strange statement. What do you mean you don't say Hallel on a miracle that took place outside the land? Yitzias Mitzrayim b'nes shechutz la'aretz heichi amrin shira. The source and the original shira we derive from Yitzias Mitzrayim. That was chutz la'aretz. Kedesanya ad shalom. So sometimes the word kedesanya means I'll bring you a proof, but here the word kedesanya means I'll give you an answer to your question as to why, in the case of Yitzias Mitzrayim, they can recite shira. Ad shalom nichnasu Yisrael la'aretz. Up until within Jewish history, until the point that we crossed the Jordan and entered into the land, Huchu kol ha'aretz l'shlom shira. Then all the lands on the face of the earth were equal. And therefore you can recite Shira, and you're obligated to recite Shira, which is exactly what we did when we left Mitzrayim. But Michenichnasu Yisrael Aretz, once we entered into the land, then that land becomes very unique. And Lo Hukshu Kol Aretz Slover Shira can no longer recite Shira for any miracle that occurred outside the land. So as far as Purim is concerned, we cannot recite Hallel because that's number one, it's Michenichnasu La'aretz, and number two, it's a Nesha B'chutz La'aretz. But the Gemara now offers a second explanation. Rav Nachman Omar, you're missing the point, says Rav Nachman. You're asking, why don't we recite Hallel? The answer is we do recite Hallel, but in a different form. Kriyasa Zui Hilula. When we read the Megillah, that is a substitute for Hallel. And this is something that's based on Rashi earlier in Masechet on Daf Daled. Rashi there says that when we gather together, we read the story of the miracle of Purim by reading the Megillah. That itself is a great Hallel. Rava Omar, Rava says, Bishlema Hasam, Hallelu Avdei Hashem. I have another answer as to why it's inappropriate to recite Hallel on Purim, because with regard to leaving Egypt, we can recite Hallel. First paragraph Hallel says, Hallelu Avdei Hashem. Below Avdei Paro, we are no longer servants to Paro. We've terminated our slavery to Paro. But here in the case of the redemption from Achashverosh and Purim, can we really recite that chapter of Hallelu Avdei Hashem? That now we are servants of Hashem, exclusively servants of Hashem. We no longer are servants of Achashverosh. The law of the Achashverosh question mark. Akati Avdei the Achashverosh Anan. We cannot declare that we are Avdei Hashem exclusively because we are still servants of Hashem. And it's very interesting that you may recall that the last psukim in the Megillah speak about the levying of taxes on the part of Achashverosh. So we had to pay those taxes. But in any event, what we see here is that both Rava and Rav Nachman agree in principle that there is Hallel on Purim. The only thing is that Rava says we can't recite that paragraph of Hallel because we're still servant of Achashverosh. And Rav Nachman says we fulfill Hallel by reading the Megillah. But Tanya, what are they going to do? Rav Nachman, the Bryce that we learned earlier, that there is no shira in the case of a miracle of Chutz La'aretz. And the Gemara answers, it means that the land of Israel was unique and all the Hallel would be concentrated in the land of Israel, but that's only as long as the Jewish people are settled in the land of Israel. But when they get never expelled and exiled from the land, then the land of Israel now, in a sense, goes back to the original status of being uniform and equal to all the lands on the face of it. So the Gemara asks, is it really true that there are only 48 prophets, as we saw earlier in the Bryce? And now the Gemara is going to take this word Ramasayim and read it as if it were two different words. And the second half of this word will be Masayim. Masayim means 200. And also, if you take the resh at the beginning of the word Masayim, Ramasayim, the Reish equals 200. And what do we derive from this? And the Gemara says we're going to derive from this, in other words, there were 200 prophets in Israel. And this pasuk is written in the context of Shmuel Aleph, the parsha of Elkanah. Elkanah lived in a generation where there was a flood of prophecy, over 200 prophets. And now you're telling me there were only 48 prophets. If in one generation there were 200 prophets, imagine how many prophets there were, hundreds of thousands maybe. The Gemara says, hey, no, you're right. Mi'ava Tuva, there were many, many prophets of Israel. We get a Sanya Arbein Avim Amdulem Israel, Keflayim, Kiyotzim, Mitzrayim. I'm not sure, but I think this is what you call a guzma. You know what a guzma is? Sometimes the Gemara gives an exaggeration to make a profound impact on us. But literally, if you take the number of Jews that left Mitzrayim, which is 600,000, you double it, you'll get to the number 1.2 million, which is equal to how many Nevi'im there were in Israel. However, what is unique about the 48 and the 7? We're talking about those Nevi'im that ultimately their Nevuah became part of what we call a Chefetz Shel Torah, part of the actual canon, the actual content of the Torah. And there were many, many Nevuahs that were very, very impressive and perhaps significant, but they were not written and they did not transform themselves from Nevuah into Torah Sheb'Chsav. So there were only 48 plus 7 that became Torah Sheb'Chsav and were incorporated into Tanakh. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani Omar, Adam haba mishtei ramos, shetzofo zu esu. I have a different take on the word Ramasayim. And what does Ramasayim mean? 2 ramos, 2 mountains. And there's a man who came from 2 mountains, and Sofo zu esu. These 2 mountains look at each other. So Elkanah lived in a place called Ramasayim Tzofim. There were 2 mountains, and they faced each other. In other words, there was a valley between 2 mountains, and that's where Elkanah came from. Rav Chanin Omar, Adam haba mipnei Adam she'omdim berumot shel olam, aniu b'nei Korach. This is really interesting. According to Rav Chanin, the Tanakh is telling us that Elkanah descended from the Bnei Korach, from Aviasaf. And what does that mean? Berumo Shalom. Why do we describe the Bnei Korach as standing at the height of the world? Because the Chsivu Bnei Korach lo mesu. So there was Gehenna, and that was burning. And had they not been lifted up above Gehenna, they would have sunk all the way down into Gehenna. And Tana Mishum Rabbeinu, we have the name of Rebbe, Makom Nisbatzel Gehenna V'Omdu Olav. So that there was a high platform in Gehenna, so they wouldn't fall to the bottom of Gehenna, and that's where they stood. Sheva Nevios Maninu, who are the 7 Nevios? Sarah, Miriam, Torah, Chana, Avigail, Hulda, Esther. The most interesting of all of these, I think, is Avigail. We'll see a whole lot more about Avigail. Sarah, how do we know Sarah was a Neviah? Detziv, Avi Malka, Avi Yiska. What does it mean, Yiska? Okay, we're talking now about Sarah. Rabbi Yitzchak Yiska zu Sarah. The word Yiska, the name Yiska, is a reference and allusion to Sarah. V'lama nikreis shma Yiska. Why was she called Yiska? Shesachsa beruach hakodesh. She saw with ruach hakodesh, meaning she saw with nevuah. Shenemar kol asher tomar elecha Sarah shma bekola. And this is a reference to the parsha of Yishmael, that Sarah wanted to get rid of Yishmael. Avram was very upset about it, but Hashem says that Sarah is a greater Neviah than you are. According to the second opinion, the name Yiska has to do with her beauty. We're going to see that she's one of the 4 most beautiful women that ever lived in the world, and has nothing to do with her status as a Neviah. Miriam. How do we know next on line Miriam? Vatikach Miriam Haneviachos Aaron. Why does it say that she was a sister to Aaron? After all, in the context of Shiras Hayom, it should have said Achos Moshe v'Achos Moshe. Or Rav Nachman or Rav Shoisim Isnabo Shehi Achos Aaron, meaning forget about Moshe. He's not born yet. Moshe was the youngest of the three, and she was already prophesizing when she was Achos Aaron, and she was not Achos Moshe. Moshe hadn't been born yet. The Omeretz Asida Imi Shetele Ben Shias Yisrael. My mother will bear a son, and he will be the Moshiach Shel Yisrael. When Moshe Rabbeinu was born, the entire house was filled with light, and this light is a spiritual kind of supernal light. And now, when her father, what was his name? Amram, when he realizes that her nevuah came to fruition, he kissed her on her head. But you'll soon see that he's going to take back that kiss. Your nevuah has come to fruition. But as a result of the fact that Paro said they had to throw Moshe into the river, he took a sandal and hit her over the head. Were you a true prophet or a false prophet? And you see, Vatesat Tzav Achoso Merochot Ladea. Ladas Ma'iyah B'Sof Nevuasa. She was absolutely convinced that Moshe Rabbeinu would somehow survive and her nevuah would be realized. Dvara, how do we know Dvara was a neviah? That said, Dvara Isha neviah Eshes Lapidos. You can't get more explicit than that. The Torah, the Tanakh explicitly in Shoftim defines and describes Dvara as a neviah. Why Eshes Lapidos? Why does the Tanakh have to emphasize that she was the wife of Lapidos? Osa Psilos Lamigdash. So we're taking the word Lapidos, which means torches, and we're talking about the wicks in the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash to make and create these torches. And she was in charge of making the wicks for the Mishkan. Here we're talking about the Mishkan of Shiloh. V'hi Yosheves Tachas Tomer, and Dvorah sat under a palm tree. Why did she choose to be sitting under a palm tree? Why should not Tachas Tomer? What's the significance of this particular tree? Amar Rav Shimon ben Avshalom. Rav Shimon ben Avshalom said, Mishum Yichud. Now, why would this protect her yichud? Men would come online to ask her questions. She was a shofetes, and the branches here are very high up, so that it didn't cover the area and hide it. So it was not yichud. It was a public area that could be seen in the public eye. It was visible to everyone. Another reason, Ma Tamar said, now Tamar, the palm tree, becomes a metaphor. Lo elalev echad. It only has one heart. Af Yisrael shebos adar lo haylem elalev echlavim shebashamayim. That was a very unique generation. Now, it says here that the sap of a tree is analogous to the heart of a living creature. The heart is the most important vital organ in the body, and the vitality of the tree depends on the flow of its sap. The sap of the palm tree is confined to the trunk and does not diffuse to all the branches as it does with other trees. The palm tree uniquely symbolizes Israel's constant and undivided allegiance to Hashem in heaven. Going on in the list Chana, how do we know that Chana was a Neviah? She declared, my heart rejoices in God, my horn is exalted by God. Rama karni v'lo Rama pachi. She says, my horn is exalted, not my flask is exalted. In other words, she is giving us a nevuah through this Karen, right? Olatz libi b'Hashem ramah karni b'Hashem. And what is this Karen? What does it metaphorically symbolize? And the answer is Karen, David Shlomo, right? David Shlomo shenivtchu b'Karen. There are two categories of kings. There are kings that are anointed with Shemen HaMikra, and then there are kings that will inherit the Melucha. But in the case of David, he could not inherit the Melucha because the Melucha was given first to Shaul HaMelech. And then the issue of why Shlomo was anointed with a horn of oil is because there were questions about his kingship. There was a whole division, if you know, of different sons of David that wanted to claim the Malchus. Anyway, Nimshecha Malchusam, the significance here symbolically of being anointed with the horn of an oil is that their Malchus would continue. Shol v'yehu nimshecha b'pach. Now we get to that second category of Mashiach of a Melech. Later on, we'll see in Kohen Gadol also the two kinds of Kohen Gadols. And this alternative was a flask of oil. And that's what Chana is emphasizing here about Karni. Those who were anointed with a flask of oil, their Malchus did not continue. Ein kadosh kashem ki ein biltecha. Again, part of Chana's prayer. There is none holy like God, for there is none besides you. Al tikri biltecha ella nevalosecha. Don't read it as biltecha, which means other than you, but rather as livalosecha, which means to survive you. If you have something that was created by man, let's say, for example, he creates a wooden table, that wooden table will continue to exist even after the creator of the table dies. God exceeds and outlives all the works of his hands. Then Chana says, which means Ein Sayar Kelokeni is the greatest Sayar. Sayar is someone who carves out something. Adam tsar tzura gabe kosel. When man carves something out on a wall, he cannot give life into it. Internal and external parts of the body. In the case of a fetus, the fetus is inside the mother's body, and he just shapes its form inside another form. Kravayim, Ubnei Me'ayim, it endows it with breath, soul, internal parts, and intestines. And we know that Abigail was a Neviah. He rocheves al chamor v'yorez b'seiser ha'ar. And the pasuk tells us in Shmuel Aleph that she was riding on a donkey and came down by the cover of the mountain. So David sends 10 men to Novel, and they request that Novel provide food for David and his men. Novel refuses, and he disgraces David by saying, who is David? Who is the son of Yishai? And that gives him the status of what's called a mored b'malchus. And David, when he found out about this, he said that we have to put Novel to death. Novel's wife was Abigail. And when she heard that David was coming to kill her, she gathered the food that they wanted, supply food, started out towards David, and tried to appease him and convince him that he shouldn't put to death her husband Novel. B'seiser ha'ar minahar mibayil, it should have said in the pasuk minahar. What is b'seiser ha'ar? Rabba bar Shmuel al iskei dam haba min hastorim. So the pasuk b'seiser, which means cover, something that's covered, is a symbolic allusion to dam nida, which comes from what's called the beis hastorim. Right, it comes out of the uterus. And al iskei dam haba min hastorim, which means not l'dam ver asalo, she sent him some of the blood, I guess, on a cloth, and she asked him, David, to paskin, as to whether or not this stain that she has is really one of the 5 categories of dam that's mitami and isha benida. Omar Lavachi Marin Dam Balayla. Why are you showing this to me at night? The halacha is that you cannot examine dam at night. You have to see it during the light of the day. Omar Lo, she said, her whole thing was just a setup in order to be able to ask, why are you establishing that my husband Noel has to be put to death and you're doing that at night? And we don't judge people at night.